The Great New Deal, a not-quite fictional preview of future history, written by Mark Terdesom, narrated by David DeBerg. Chapter 20, Far from Shangri-La. She was the first woman president. It was supposed to be a big deal, but it turned out to be a bum deal, and it was clearly not what she signed up for. When the Great Surprise and the associated celebratory protests occurred, the president moved below the White House into the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, while she, the vice president, stayed at an austere secret facility beneath the Pentagon. They made infrequent public appearances, almost always together, but most of their public communications were made using video recordings or through their press offices. The Great Pacific Disaster, as they dubbed the Saturday night volcanic eruption, earthquakes, and tsunamis that demolished Hawaii and California and damaged the western parts of Oregon and Washington, shook the nation's infrastructure, economy, and military readiness. This compounded the lingering disruption from the Great Surprise and the pandemic. Immediately after the Great Pacific Disaster, everyone started making demands of the president, and he was at a clear disadvantage without his speaker. North Korea threatened to nuke Anchorage if the U.S. didn't agree to all its demands. Instead, she, in her then role as vice president, worked out a deal with China. You take care of North Korea, and we'll look the other way when you reabsorb Taiwan. Bingo, problem solved. And China picked up 2 new provinces. That close call rattled the party bigwigs, and a few days later they implemented the 25th Amendment provisions, making her the new president. But there was no big inauguration gala. Instead, they recorded a video of the ceremony in front of a green screen. Then the tech geeks added the CGI backdrops and CGI crowds with an audio track of thunderous applause and patriotic music, so the event could be broadcast to the nation later, when broadcasting was reestablished. Her predecessor was relocated to protective custody at the new Presidential Security Facility at Camp David. The United Congress Housekeeping Committee decided this was less costly than maintaining Secret Service protection for each former president. It also promoted unity by reducing the risk of discordant political messages. So she moved into the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. The continuing unstable conditions in Washington, D.C. required that she spend most of her days and nights down there eating the chow prepared by Navy cooks. The first woman president has to eat chow. It was outrageous, even if the chow was nutritious and sometimes even delicious. "Now I'm living in the damn basement," she muttered. Tall fencing, razor wire, and the National Guard were keeping things relatively quiet and secure around most essential federal buildings in Washington, D.C. Even so, a contingent from the United Congress visited this morning and requested she approve electrified fencing and selective use of landmines. "Let's put that idea on hold for now, but circle back later if we see things deteriorating further," she told them. Every minute of every day she had to deal with nonstop problems and demands. How could Trump and Reagan have handled this kind of workload at their age and without any prior federal government experience? The nationwide collection of all unregistered firearms and ammunition was proving to be much more difficult than they had expected. Evidently, people really did cling to their guns and Bibles, like that former president had once said. There was some good news. The FBI director phoned her and reported the USA One FBCN podcast this morning disclosed the subversive podcast broadcast base was not deep beneath the ocean, as previously claimed. It was actually deep in an abandoned uranium mine in Shangri. The FBI director was going to personally lead an expedition to find the mine and destroy this secret base. She told the FBI director to spare no expense and not to return to D.C. until he completed this mission. You could make a list of everything you needed and write shortage after every item on the list. Gasoline, food, electricity, medicine, police, and toilet paper, for example. People were almost always agitated, and there were daily reports of sometimes peaceful protests, often impeded by armed neighborhood protective associations. The military chiefs warned her the U.S. defense shield and nuclear arsenal were only mostly working, and that they had critical shortages of equipment and people. They complained about having the nuclear carriers and submarines anchored and tethered to the electric grid in stateside ports. China was making more demands, and there was saber rattling all over the world, from Russia, Iran, and a whole lot of other places. There were regional skirmishes and tribal conflicts. The United Nations was no help, as it was still in transition, rebuilding its leadership and relocating from its decimated New York building to temporary facilities in Europe and the Middle East. NATO had voted to kick out Canada and the United States and was negotiating a merger with the United Nations. Not to mention the many epidemics, nasty diseases not seen for hundreds of years and brand new plagues from who knows where. Variant after variant of the coronavirus. The WHO and CDC had no serious answers for far too many serious questions. Today's morning cabinet briefing brought some good news and cheered her up a bit. The Secretary of World Peace reported the non-aggression pacts with the U.S. were signed by Iran and Saudi Arabia. The shipments of nuclear devices and equipment were being unloaded from Navy ships to the two countries. Yesterday, the Treasury reported receipt of $508 billion from the two purchasers. This should be a major world peace triumph, but they needed to keep it totally secret. That joy was short-lived when her chief of staff came in with two messages. The Israeli Prime Minister insisted on a phone call with her immediately. The chief of staff thought he sounded furious. Had Israel learned about the non-aggression pacts and nuclear weapon sales? How? And how could she deal with the Prime Minister? On top of that, the United Congress Executive Committee chair wanted her to be in his office today at 5 p.m. sharp. That didn't sound good. How could things have gotten so messed up? What do they want me to do? I'm not the Wizard of Oz. This has been The Great New Deal, a not-quite-fictional preview of future history, written by Mark Tradisum, narrated by David DeBerg. Copyright 2021 and 2020 by Mark C. Tradisum. Production copyright by Mark C. Tradisum.